And now we're going to get a slightly different view. I think Neil is very honed in on certain technologies. The IEEE actually has a somewhat different problem when it looks at what we're dealing with AR and how we come to address with it. Just very quickly, I want to introduce you to the IEEE in case you're not familiar with it. It is actually the world's largest professional association that works in technology. And its overarching message is that we are advancing technology for humanity. But at this point, as you can see, we've got a lot of things in a lot of different areas. The numbers are large and the activity is large, and you begin to see where that might become very interesting when you start thinking about AR. You see the very large groups also in standards. We have both within standards and within the IEEE a huge number of activities that are going on in a broad swath of technology. We cover everything down from broadcast technologies down to testing, to nanotech, and of course landman. And those, of course, means that IEEE has a wonderful resource. It's an incredibly broad organization and very deep within those areas that it has. But that creates a challenge when you start looking at augmented reality as well. Because when we look at AR and we look at standards, we know what standards are going to do for people. We know how they can address and help us, and what if they do it right, you're probably not even aware that they are there. The fact that all of you are using IEEE technologies right now, because most of you probably own a cell phone and the computers in this room also have wire-to-wireless communications, means all of you are using IEEE every single day. But it's something that you don't see because a good standard done right isn't very, very visible. We know that for AR to move forward, it needs to have standards. It's that simple. But for us, AR is a very interesting situation. AR is one of those technologies, to our mind, that cuts across industries. Yes, there are needs for AR standards in and of themselves. But the other challenge that we have is introducing AR into all of these other existing technology areas. And for IEEE, with a very broad-based organization and a very broad-based number of standards, if we go back here and look at this list, technically any one of those areas could be impacted by AR. So we view it as yes, it has its own vertical, its own needs as an industry, as a technology, but it's also a cross-cutter. And it's going to go across all sorts of things. And if you listened to ourselves in the introductions, you heard building technology, you heard medical, you heard educational, you heard manufacturing and product line. So you're hearing AR being applied just in this room to probably a dozen technologies. Now extrapolate it out. We're thinking about that at IEEE because we have this kind of breadth. And this is the challenge that we're facing as we begin to roll out AR and make it a tool that not only we embrace and we use, but that we are espousing into all of our groups and expanding out into the specific needs of AR itself. So when you look at the IEEE, we know that we can offer a platform for developers and users worldwide to innovate on open interoperable AR. And what we want to do is work on educating those stakeholder communities, looking at the research that's out there, monitoring it and expanding it, and then looking at the AR user requirements in and of itself to foster and grow this market. So we've been looking at our standards. IEEE has about 900 standards right now, about another 500 in process at any point. We have 20,000 active standards developers who work on those 1,400, 1,500 projects right now. So we took a look at what we currently had. We said, let's examine our house and see what's happening. And we looked at them from various points of view. And what we did is we found a number of our standards that have a relevancy to AR and that indeed can be impacted by AR. I could get into a much broader list, to be very honest with you. I wouldn't bore you all with a bunch of names and numbers. But the fact is, there are all sorts of different technologies and communities represented on here. You can see things like body area networks, personal area networks, learning technologies are in there, 3D model imaging and display, And that group has expanded out recently in a whole bunch of ways that are going to be impacted by this. But I wanted to take a few of them and to show you what we've been thinking about and how we're starting to address those AR concerns within those communities. And it goes on. What do you do with all the battery communications we're using? If we're using cell phones or we're using computers, what are their capacities for what we're going to demand of them when AR comes on top of everything? How are they going to be able to handle it? And all of this is the kind of thing that we're looking at. Health informatics is a huge area. Medical device communications is something we do a lot of work in. When they're supposed to be communicating information using AR, what do? So this is the challenge that we're facing right now. And I'm just going to dig into a few. And this is to give you a sample of what we're challenged with when we look at this and what we're excited about, to be very honest with you, in seeing what could be done with AR, how we can expand it and tie it into communities that probably haven't thought of it at all. Here's real-time mobile video communications, all right, which can be vastly impacted by AR, okay? When you're looking at how you communicate through a mobile device using cloud devices, when you're going to be having assets built in, you're going to be overlaying that onto what you have. How is that affecting the communications channel? How are you devouring that? How are you going to be able to work it? So it's got a really pretty large relevance in terms of time management and in terms of workflow. And this is the kind of thing that we're examining and looking at. For our mobile experience, which is really dealing with trying to find a way to address the needs of mobile communications when you're in the car, when you're traveling, et cetera. Particularly, it's looking at time-shifted caching. How can you manage that? How can you standardize it so it doesn't matter what system you're getting the information from, or how you're changing the provider as you move along in your mobile space. And so now we're working with this group to deliver the mobile content to them. This group is actually very excited by the possibilities of AR and looking at what they can do to now shift themselves to move themselves forward, keeping in mind that standards are living documents. They constantly change. There is no such thing as a standard that once set does not change. And that in and of itself is what they are embracing. Again, this one has a huge impact on how do you handle the digital assets? How do you take those, put those into a mobile system, then say that you've cached it, then have that caching impacted by another contact? How does that balance out? And that's what they're trying to figure out. 3D medical imaging. Medicine is one of the areas that will probably hugely embrace 3D first in terms of practical industry use. Hospitals want this desperately. Operating rooms want this desperately. So we have a lot of standards that are coming out related to how we can impact that moving forward. And so in this particular group, there are all of these cases where they're using this medical data. How do you then deliver it to them in an AR experience? How do you deliver it to the surgeon in the operating room and get it to them and make that there? So they're standardizing on what are the requirements for the content display for these 3D medical images. Now we're saying to them, okay, you're thinking about the 3D medical images, but have you thought about the fact that you can augment them? And this has been something that to them is the next step that they have to consider. So here we go. How do we deal with all of these assets, in this case, the physical world assets, impacting this program? And then we get into the modeling and simulation standards that IEEE has, and it has a whole series of standards related to that. It's a huge group for interaction and simulation. Well, that's basically AR, in a nutshell, is all about simulation. So what can we do to augment that and add to those simulation standards an aspect that they haven't considered very strongly, which is AR? And this is another group. There's another one here, distributed interactive simulation modeling. So when you're having something that isn't necessarily a one-way stream but a two-way stream, then how are you looking at what you can do with AR? Just a couple more examples to throw in there. Audio-video coding as an example. System and software reuse. How do we move that forward? I haven't even gotten into the 802 body area network, wide area network, personal area network standards. Those are huge families of standards. Numbers on top of numbers with letters and things thrown in. It's very complicated. But that's a huge base. That group nutshelled in a group called 802.15, is actually very excited by AR. And they've had a number of presentations, discussions to get them thinking about using AR in a way that they've never used it before. So these are communities that are just becoming aware of the AR technologies, of the AR providers, and what they can do. So these are just a few of those examples of what can be done. So with all of that in mind, and that's just me picking a few and saying, here they are, here's what they're looking at. So what are we doing now to try to continue this out? We've been developing a number of our own assets for market education awareness programs that we can start taking those out to our diverse communities and saying, this is coming, this is as cross-cutting as anything you may have thought of. Everybody's aware of IoT right now. It's the biggest buzzword out there. You're all reading it everywhere. We're all seeing it everywhere. We can put everything into IoT that you can think of. AR does the same thing. So getting them aware of that and engaged in these ways, we think is extremely valuable. And then also, we're looking at our own groups to make them extremely aware of what's happening. So we're actually doing grassroots evangelization, going out to these groups, speaking to them, engaging with them one-on-one in various ways to make them aware of what they should be considering to put AR into their scope of work and making it possible for something else to be built that's standardized and that meets existing standards and then extends the market for AR. And then finally, we're trying to drive it across all of IEEE. If you remember that first slide that I showed you that was very, very broad-based, here are these organizations, 1,300 conferences a year, 3.6 million documents right now in our library. And that's probably 3.7 now. In terms of how it moves forward. How do we get AR across all of IEEE? A few of our areas are somewhat aware of it. Some of our more cross-cutting publications and information have done things with AR, such as a magazine we produce called Spectrum. They're very interested in AR and coming back to us on that. But we are working to try to find other ways to increase that knowledge across the IEEE. So it's not just standards where I come from, but how do we tie it into all the conferences and build that connection where there are relevant conferences that aren't even aware that they should be taking an AR angle? What do we do about the publications? How do we build that connection in publications or roll it out through the various societies that IEEE has, like communications, computer, learning and education? How do we move that? That's the kind of thing that we're facing as a challenge and integrating right now. And so we're continuing to do that, and we'll do even more. Honestly, I think we've barely scratched the surface. And we will be rolling this out IEEE-wide within the next 1 to 2 years and trying to make it a very broad-based, forward-looking program that embraces all of those elements. And these are just a few of those examples that we have in the IEEE that we think relate to AR that are in our verticals right now, where we have standards, where we have work going on, where we have programs, conferences, publications, major areas of communication and engagement, where we hope we can bring that out and help those communities engage. And just to help you out, you can look up more in these places, reach out to me, but there is a great deal going on with that to build it out into something that goes beyond the traditional AR silo. And that's what I have to share with you today. Thank you.
Afternoon. So we won't be having our presentation about the Open Geospatial Consortium standards right now, since he's gone. But Mary Lynn, I think there might be some questions. You want to hang on just a few minutes and see if there are any questions. We'll make some time for Martin when he can join us again. We'll follow up and complete this part of the session because I don't want you to miss out on the OGC's family of standards and in particular the ARML 2.0 specification that Martin has worked on for several years. Are there any questions for Mary Lynn? She can take them from, I think she should stay up here. Yes, please.
So my question was around, I saw the training area on the last slide there. Is there a does IEEE do anything around performance support standards for that, like real-time heads-up display type stuff?
Not specifically at this time. It's much more integrated into our learning technologies areas that are looking specifically at the tools and the mechanisms of delivery of training that's around that. So it has not specifically been put forward as a standards area. It could be.
It's a thought, because I feel that that instead of drawing a line where there's training on one side, that just might be kind of a mode of an overall system that for performance support that you use in your job. So you might have a training mode, but not necessarily, here's your training product.
Right. Well, that's actually part of what we have as consideration, and where we're looking at the diverse technologies that we have, is using AR as a training tool has been part of what we're saying to all of them as well. When we're looking at our learning technologies groups, it's how you offer the training. Is there anything standardized in the delivery of it or in the methodologies by which you're delivering that information? So it's not just the information in and of itself, how you deliver it, the mechanisms, the tools, the platforms, etc., that are being analyzed for that, and that takes place. So it's a two-pronged approach that we would take in that. So the one group specifically would look at that, and then you get into the technology specifically.
And I could give just what Mary Lynne said about getting into the specific technology offerings. There's an example of a project that's come out of past IEEE work with the ADL, you know, the Advanced Distributed Learning, I think is what that stands for, DoD project, and the Experience API, which is about a year old or so for learning and instructional design and so forth. We started a group, and you're going to hear a little bit more, I think, about Experience API as a tool that has been implemented, at least in one case that we know of, to track the performance of the user, well, their actions, their activities over the course of using an AR browser. So Fridolin will be talking about how you can take something that was designed for learning and add it into an AR platform.
Great.
So I think I just want to thank you, Mary Lynne. Are there any other questions?